Hi guys, welcome to History with Robin. If you can't guess and you don't know already, we are going to be talking about the Oregon Trail today, which is actually one of my favorite things to talk about history. So I was really happy to be able to talk about it. Hi, Mackenzie. I'm so glad you are excited about talking about the Oregon Trail. Yes, we in Oregon, there is the museum, the end of the Oregon Trail Museum, which I know is close to your house, and you can visit and learn. Hi, guys. Okay. Good. Well, I have always really loved learning about the Oregon Trail. It's been a favorite part of history of mine. I live in Oregon now, but even before I lived in Oregon, I always loved learning about it. So I am dressed as someone from the Oregon Trail. You know, I have my little bonnet, my sun bonnet, which would help protect their face. I have a little handkerchief around my neck. And yeah, great. So I am dressed as a pioneer. Okay, great. So let's get started. Let me just share and as you can see, my background is the Oregon Trail, what they call wagon trains, which is how the pioneers traveled the Oregon Trail. And yeah, that's my background. I just really liked that picture. Okay, so we're gonna do my slideshow now. So mountain men is the first thing we're gonna talk about, and then we're gonna get to the Oregon Trail. So remember, if you were part of my one last time, we talked a little bit about the exploration of the West. And so by the 1820s, much of America's land east of the Mississippi River was becoming settled. That was all due to things like the canals we talked about last time, the locks, building the national road. And so that's the green part of this map here. So you can see where the green part of the map is. Most of that was settled. Sorry, I lost my place. I apologize. But very few pioneers had moved into the blue part west of the river, which was the area from the Louisiana Purchase. So you can see it's kind of that blue and white striped land. That was still considered the frontier. There were no roads and almost no Americans went there. But one of the things that started to change that was that the fashions for hats began to change. And maybe you might wonder what hats have to do with exploration and moving westward. Well, we're going to talk about that. So hat makers had invented a process where they could take the fur from beavers, from the animal beavers, and make it into hats. Back then, almost everybody wore a hat. And the hats were made from beaver fur, which was very high quality, and it became really super popular and very fashionable. And here I have some pictures of some different beaver style hats. So as you can see, they're kind of, I think some of them look kind of funny, but I'm wearing a bonnet today, so somebody might think that looks kind of funny. But those hats became really, really popular. And so because they were so popular, they wanted to figure out how to find more beavers. So the Europeans really loved beaver style hats. Americans really loved them, and they bought millions of them every year. And in Europe, where the hats were really popular, there weren't enough beavers around for every hat that they wanted to buy. So, but in America, in an area called the Rocky Mountains, there were beavers who lived in the creeks and the streams. But that area was kind of wilderness. So how would anybody ever even get to them? So you can see in the Rocky Mountains, there were a lot of beavers who lived there. So how would people get to them? At first, the traders would buy the beavers, or the beaver skins, from the Native Americans that lived around the Rocky Mountains. The traders would set up trading posts, and the Native Americans would come there with their beaver skins to trade. And that's what you can see a picture of on the right. But then there were some very adventurous Americans who decided that they didn't want to just trade the beavers, they wanted to actually trap them and catch them themselves. So they were called mountain men. That's what we call them. And it was really dangerous work, and many died because of attacks from the Native Americans, which makes sense because they were sort of trespassing on their land, or grizzly bears, or by freezing. And so it was dangerous, hard work. But if they didn't die, then they had a chance to earn a lot of money. Lorna asks, isn't the beaver Oregon's official state animal? Yes, it is. We have a lot of beavers here, or we did. So these are these mountain men. So these really adventurous men, they got along well. Often they got along well with the Native Americans. So instead of having trading posts every year, they would arrange a big get together called a rendezvous, which is a French word, which is why it's spelled so like a way that doesn't make sense when you read it. Mountain men and Native Americans from all over would get together, and for several days they would trade and visit and have fun. And you can see a picture of that at the bottom. So we're going to talk about one famous mountain man in general, and his name was Joseph Meek. He was born in 1810 in Virginia. As a child, he was friendly and funny, but he didn't get along with his stepmother. He had trouble in school and never actually learned to read. He had too much energy, and he didn't like to sit around. He didn't like to sit still, and he wanted to be out and exploring, and he wanted more adventure. So when he was 16 in 1826, he left home and he moved out west to the edge of the frontier in Missouri. But even though that was more adventurous than where he was from, it wasn't adventurous enough for him. So he decided to become a mountain man. And when he was 19, he went into the Rocky Mountains, and he spent the next 10 years trapping beaver and meeting at rendezvous to trade. He did many adventures. He did have many adventures, including one time when he was attacked by a bear, but he didn't have his gun. But he was very lucky that he survived. And this, I think, is a picture of him surviving that bear attack, which would have been very adventurous, maybe too adventurous for me. So often, Meeks lived among the Native American tribes where he was trapping the beavers. In 1835, he married a woman from one of the Native American tribes, and he loved her very much. And once he even saved her from an attack from a different tribe. But sadly, even though he saved her from an attack from a different tribe, she died later in attack from another tribe. Oh, sorry guys, I went the wrong direction. But later in 1838, he married another Native American woman named Virginia, who he loved very much as well. And they had 7 children together, which was a lot of children. By 1840, there weren't enough beavers left to make a good living as a trapper. So they kind of threw the popularity of the beaver hats and other things like that, they kind of had over-trapped the beavers. So they didn't have as many to make a good living. But at that time, there was going to be a new group of pioneers, a new kind of adventure that Joseph Meek could go on, which was a group of pioneers who wanted to go to Oregon. And they were coming from about Missouri, and they wanted to make it all the way to Oregon, but they might need directions from a mountain man. Oh, good catch, Lorna. You cannot talk to a mountain. I actually meant to say mountain man there. So I think my picture went over the top of that last word. So they might need directions from a mountain man, and they actually hired Joseph Meek in order to guide them and give them directions. Ethan, what a great suggestion to do something, a history class that has to do with Japan, maybe around World War II. Yes, we'll see. We'll see when we get there, but I'm sure if we end up talking about World War II, we will definitely talk about Japan. So you guys might notice this arrow at the bottom that says Oregon or bust. And that was something that these pioneers said, like they were going to make it to Oregon, or they were going to like not in such a way, but they were going to work really hard and do whatever they could to make it to Oregon. It kind of became a little bit of their slogan, their thing that they said. So why did they need directions to Oregon? No one had a map on how to get to Oregon in a wagon. Now there had been, Lewis and Clark had gotten to Oregon, but they had taken a series of rivers and they had taken horses over the mountain, and but they didn't have any idea of how they could do it in a wagon. And their starting point was a city called Independence, Missouri. So imagine standing in Independence, Missouri and asking somebody for directions, and all they say is they point and they say, go that way for a few thousand miles. That's not really super helpful. So you can imagine, like if you wanted to get to Oregon and they're like, go west for thousands of miles, you can't, it doesn't really help you. You can maybe like, are you going to run into rivers? Are you going to run into mountains? How are you going to get over the mountains? What kind of things do you need? So that's why they needed somebody. But luckily, Joseph Meek knew how to get there, and he wanted to go to Oregon with his new family to settle down. So in 1840, he and another mountain man found out about a small group of pioneers who wanted to go there, and they agreed to lead them. And you can see, if you've ever studied anything about the Oregon Trail before, you know that they crossed from Missouri to Oregon in covered wagons, usually led by different teams of oxen or horses. And that's just a picture. And they'd be in what was called wagon trains, where they would just, like in this picture, you can see it's like one wagon following another wagon, and almost like they made up a train all together. So there was no road, there was no wagon trail. They were going to have to kind of make this road together. And they had a lot of difficulty going through this really rough country. No one had ever gotten a wagon through to Oregon before. And imagine having to drive a wagon over no road and through the sort of territory that looks like the picture to the right, where it's like lots of bushes and hills, and you're kind of having to go over those things. But they went along, and they actually started to create a road or create a trail little bit by little bit. So they had to cross rivers that had no bridges, which was very dangerous. And what they would actually do, as you can see from this picture, they would try to drive they'd kind of turn the wagons a little bit into a boat, if that kind of makes sense. And they would try to float the wagon across the river with the horses still attached, and the horses were in front, swimming, pulling forward, and then the wagon itself would kind of float across the river. That was one way that they had to cross some rivers. Later pioneers had things like ferries, which was kind of like maybe a raft or some sort of boat, which they could drive their wagon onto and cross the river. But for these first pioneers going, they had to figure out how to do it themselves when nobody else had done it before. And it was really easy to drown, or the wagons would turn over in the current, which obviously would be a really bad thing. I'm not sure, Lorna, great question. Where was that picture taken? I'm not totally sure where it was, but it was just one of the river crossings. And Lila, I'm glad you think this is really cool. I also think it's very cool, so I like sharing it with you guys. And they had another thing is that they had to find ways over the mountains. And this picture, though a little like grainy and maybe not totally easy to see, you can see though the wagon and the men in front of it are actually, a bunch of them are getting together and pulling the wagon up over those rocks. So they had animals, but at some places on mountains or things where it was like really, really steep, they would have to, not only would the animals do it, but if the animals couldn't, then the men in the group and maybe the women and the children, as much anybody who could help, would have to help push or pull the wagon over the mountain. So not only, you know, was it maybe, you know, hard, but then they ended up having to do some hard work. And Lorna, yes, great, like through a mountain pass, exactly, mountain passes are like narrow little spaces around or through a mountain. And so if you didn't want to, like, let's say you wanted to get to Oregon, you have to go over the Rocky Mountains or through the Rocky Mountains. And if you actually want to go around them, you're going to end up going really far out of your way. Yes, Ethan, you have played the Oregon Trail card game. There is a video game and a card game. I played it a lot when I was little on the computer called the Oregon Trail, where you basically go on an adventure trying to get your family to Oregon. Sawra, I hope I said your name right. I'm so sorry if I didn't. What kind of animals did they have? They used different animals. A lot of people used oxen, which was like a big, strong bull, like a cow, but stronger because they were really strong. They could pull a lot. They could go for a long time without getting tired, and they ate grass. So other families had horses. But the problem with having horses is that you would have to bring hay and like seed along to feed them. So, so a lot of them ended up using oxen, which would just eat the grass. How long ago was this? So it was in 1840 was the first group. I think 1840, 1841 was the first group that passed. So it is about 180 years ago. So that was quite a long time ago. And these people were so adventurous and so brave because they were going to this place that they didn't really have a map for. They didn't really know what to expect, but they really wanted to get to Oregon because they believed that Oregon was going to be easier to farm there. There was a lot of land. Things would grow easily there, which is actually true. Things do really grow easily in Oregon. We have a lot of farming here, grow grapes, apples, hazelnuts, a lot of really great things. So these pioneers, they wanted to come to Oregon to build a new life, but they had to work really hard to get here. So with their experience, as mountain men, Joseph Meek and this other mountain man were able to help these pioneers through the mountains and over the plains with no trails safely. And in December of 1840, they arrived in the Willamette Valley in Oregon. Has anybody ever been to the Willamette Valley in Oregon? I actually live in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. Not close to the end of the Oregon Trail, but in the same sort of area where the pioneers were. And yes, Cypress, I see, yes, you do live here. Good. So that's where they ended up going. Nice, Lorna, that you have been to the Willamette Valley. It's a really beautiful place. Sometimes, mostly because I really like talking about the Oregon Trail. I like to imagine what it might be like to see the Willamette Valley for the first time, and these pioneers, especially after having traveled so far and for so long. I can just only imagine how happy they were to finally make it. So Joseph Meek had helped blaze the Oregon Trail. Trailblazing means to be the first to find and make the way for something. So the Oregon Trail runs over 2,200 miles from Independence, Missouri, which you can see at the end of this red line, to Oregon City, Oregon. So all of that, that's a long, long way. Now, we could drive that in 4 days if we wanted to. If we got in a car in Independence, Missouri, and we drove straight through on the roads and on the highways and things like that, it would only, it would only take us 4 days. But back then, by wagon train, it usually took 4 months. Riley, I'm sorry that you can't hear me. Hopefully that technical difficulty gets sorted out. And you are right, Eliana, hope I said your name right. The pioneers also used mules. That's very true. The mules were also strong and fast, but you are right. The oxen were more reliable. They could actually carry, pull longer distances and heavier things, and they were more dependable. So you're right. The mules were faster, but the oxen were more dependable. Okay, great. So the next year in 1841, a group of 70 pioneers set off to make their way to Oregon using the Oregon Trail. They were going to follow the trail that was created the year before. So then the next year after that, in 1842, around 130 pioneers followed and settled near Salem, which is the capital of Oregon and only about an hour away actually from where I live. So you can see over the next, so 1840, it was the first time that these pioneers crossed to Oregon. And then as word started getting around and people saw that it was possible, it was really hard, but it was possible, more and more people wanted to come. So then the next year after that, in 1843, around 1,000 men, women, and children loaded up their wagons and they headed for Oregon. So now, if you were going to go on a 4-month trip, what would you pack? So can you imagine? I mean, if you were going to go on a 4-month trip now, and you were going to sail around the world for 4 months, or you were going to, I mean, you maybe wouldn't really be able to drive around the world for 4 months, but if you were on a 4-month trip somewhere, you wouldn't have to really pack all your food. Maybe you'd pack some of it or most of it. But now we have stores and you can stop and you can buy more food, or you can order things on Amazon, and the pioneers, they didn't have any of that. So they actually had to pack the most of the food that they were going to want to eat. Some of the pioneers, they could hunt and maybe kill deer or buffalo or bison or other animals to have some fresh meat, but a lot of the food they actually pack themselves. So this thing that I'm just going to read you, the first thing that's in italics, is actually from a book that a man called Joel Palmer, who came to Oregon, I'm not sure the exact year, but he wrote a book giving suggestions to people of what they should pack, what they need to bring, and what they sort of need to know. So this is his suggestion for one adult: 200 pounds of flour, 30 pounds of pilot bread, which is something, they're like really hard crackers that basically have all of the moisture cooked out of them. Like think of like a stale cracker or really stale bread, so they don't go bad. 75 pounds of bacon, 10 pounds of rice, 5 pounds of coffee, 2 pounds of tea, 25 pounds of sugar, half a bushel of dried beans, 1 bushel of dried fruit, 2 pounds of salderus, which is what they called baking soda then, 10 pounds of salt, half a bushel of cornmeal, and it is well to have a half a bushel of corn parched, which means dried and ground, and a small keg of vinegar should also be taken. So that is just the amount of food for one person. And you're right, Hadia, I would pack everything I have. When did 1,000 people go on the Oregon Trail, Riley? I think that was 1843, I think is what I said. Sorry, talking about all this walking is making my throat dry. What is a bushel? Think of a bushel. It is a unit of measurement, Violet. That's a great question. I actually don't know the exact unit of measurement, but if you think of like a barrel of something or like a big basket of it. Gayatri, yes, pack 100 apples. One of the things that they also packed they packed dried fruit. So if you think about buying fruit and you have fruit in your fridge or fruit on your counter, it doesn't actually last very long. But if you have dried fruit, then it'll last a lot longer. Sorry, guys. So they did need to have their own wagons. So they would have to have their own wagons just to carry all those things. Now, what else would you want to pack? Well, another major thing that you would want to pack, somebody said guns and ammunition. I don't know who that was. Very much so you would want to pack guns and ammunition, like bullets, so that you could shoot animals as needed for food and maybe protect your family. Here is a list of clothing. This was from another similar book, which gave suggestions of what to bring. So you can see 2 flannel shirts, undershirts, underwear, handkerchiefs, socks, boots, and that's just for one person. Hay, Cypress, yes, if you have animals, you are going to want to bring hay. The pioneers also packed other things in their wagons. Some of them brought rocking chairs, family furniture, books, Bibles, diaries. But you had to be really smart about what you decided to pack, because sometimes you'd run out of room. Or your wagon would get too heavy, or your wagon would break down and you'd have to start to walk. So many pioneers actually ended up getting rid of the extra heavy things that they didn't need. And so you'd sometimes see rocking chairs or chests of drawers or things like that on the side of the trail. Evelyn, great. A wet wheat stone is a stone wheel that you can use to sharpen a knife. So they would have that because they'd want their knives to be sharpened. Sorry, just one second, guys. Oops. So a wagon might be set up. Oh, sorry, I'm having a I'm just trying to get my picture just right, sorry. So sometimes they would set up a wagon. They'd obviously have all the supplies in the wagon, but sometimes they'd put bedding or different things on top of it so that the family could sleep in it. But many times they'd sleep in tents or they'd just sleep outside, because actually the most important thing that they needed when they were crossing was they needed storage space. They needed a place to store their food, their guns, their clothes, all those things. So, and it was not cheap. So a complete wagon, a yoke of oxen, meaning 2 oxen in a yoke, or 6 in total, The food for a family of 5, clothing, tools, guns, would be a minimum of $600, which would be like $15,000 today. So it was not a cheap thing to be able to do. I'm gonna leave this here for just a second so you guys can kind of see an example of how they would maybe pack the inside of the wagon. I'm a little surprised in this picture that there is a stove in the wagon because it's so heavy. You can see the black thing at the back is a stove. I'm a little surprised that this family in this picture packed a stove. But you can see they kind of crammed everything in there. So by 1845, the number of pioneers traveling the Oregon Trail was up to 3,000. I'm sure that's 3,000 per year. So Native Americans who owned the land that the pioneers passed through, and usually there was no trouble. So for letting the pioneers pass through, sometimes the Native Americans wanted gifts like horses or cattle, and usually they could make a deal about that. Sorry. If the pioneers didn't give gifts, sometimes the Native Americans would try to steal the horses. Only very rarely would the Native Americans attack the pioneers along the way. But if we sort of see things from the Native American point of view, they didn't know who these people were, and they were coming through their land. So depending on, like we've talked about before, depending on the side of the story you're on, sometimes you see things differently. Mostly they got along really well because the pioneers weren't trying to take their land, they were just trying to pass through. Even without much danger from the Native Americans, the trip was dangerous. You could get sick and die. You could get run over by a wagon. You could get stampeded by cattle, drowned in the river, or get bitten by rattlesnakes. So many people actually died along the way. But despite the danger, even with danger, more and more people started coming. So by 1866, which is 26 years after it first started, more than 350,000 people had used the trail to move west and start new lives in Oregon or California. So many people traveled on it that actually in many places in Oregon and California and along the way, you can actually see the ruts in the ground, like the little railings in the ground that the wagons created. And that is the old Oregon Trail. And that's actually, I think that's really, really fascinating and super cool. And you can see that's what's in my picture right there. You can actually go to places and see where the Oregon Trail is. Joseph Meek, he settled down near Oregon City to become a farmer and raise his family. He taught himself to read and write. He became a sheriff, and then he became a representative. In 1847, he went to Washington, D.C. to help Oregon become part of the United States. And the people really loved him in Washington, D.C. because he was funny and he had a lot of adventurous stories to tell. Eliana, sorry, I'm sure I said your name wrong. You'd pack a small bed or an airbag to sleep on at night. Yes, I would do that too. They slept on things called sleeping pads. Think of like maybe something that goes underneath your sleeping bag now. They were not very comfortable, but better than nothing. So Joseph Meek died at the age of 65 in 1875. His was a very full life of adventures and accomplishments. Because of the trail he created, the Oregon Trail, hundreds of thousands of Americans found a new life in Oregon. He also was able to help Oregon become a state and became one of our state representatives. Thank you guys so much. I hope you enjoyed learning about the Oregon Trail as much as I enjoyed talking about it. If you're interested in finding out more about the courses that I use to create these, you guys can check out Heron Books. And I hope to see you guys tomorrow when we're talking about the gold rush. Okay, have a great day, and I will see you guys tomorrow.